The freezing rain of London did not care for his former titles. It soaked through Prince Adrian's thin trench coat, turning the silk lining, once a symbol of his status, into a cold, clinging shroud. He stood pressed against the cold stone of the palace perimeter, a shadow among shadows, watching the procession of the elite. Each carriage that rolled past was a reminder of the world that had vomited him out. He was waiting for a ghost. He had heard the whispers in the low-end taverns that the Ashbourne fortune had been consolidated by a woman of mysterious origin and iron will. He had come to beg the new duke for a reprieve on his debts, never imagining the truth. The clip-clop of a matched pair of white stallions signaled the arrival of the final carriage. It was a masterpiece of black lacquer and gold leaf, bearing a crest that made Adrian's heart stutter, the Ashbourne Phoenix. As the carriage slowed, the gaslight from a nearby street lamp cut through the gloom, illuminating the interior through the polished glass. Adrian froze, his breath hitched in a throat roar from the winter air. Inside, draped in emerald velvet that seemed to drink the light, sat a woman. Her profile was a study in regal poise, shoulders back, chin slightly tilted, her gaze fixed forward with a terrifying, calm indifference. It was a face he had kissed in the secret corners of the royal gardens, a face he had watched crumble into tears 10 years ago when he told her she wasn't enough to be his princess. But the girl he had abandoned was a creature of soft cotton and shy smiles. This woman was a monument of power. Nestled in her dark, expertly styled hair was the Ashbourne tiara, its massive pear-cut diamonds catching the light and fracturing it into 1,000 jagged spears. The crowned ghost of his past didn't look like a woman who had suffered. She looked like a woman who had conquered. "Elena," he whispered, the name tasting like ash and old regret. The carriage came to a halt. The king's guard stepped forward, their red tunics vibrant against the grey rain, forming a wall of steel between the discarded prince and the woman he had traded for a lie. As the footman opened the door, Elena Ashbourne turned her head. For a split second, her eyes swept over the shadows where he stood. There was no flash of recognition, no spark of old love, only the cold, sterile gaze of a sovereign looking at a stain on the pavement. Adrian stepped forward, his hand reaching out instinctively toward the emerald glow, but the heavy iron gates began to groan shut, severing the path between the man in the mud and the queen he had created. The memory of that day always smelled of ozone and wet wool. 10 years ago, the sky over the Valecrest stables had been the color of a bruised lung, heavy with a downpour that turned the pristine training grounds into a graveyard of mud. Elena had stood there, her simple cotton dress clinging to her shivering frame, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate hope that this was all some cruel jest of the court. But Prince Adrian had not been joking. He stood before her in a riding cloak of charcoal cashmere, his expression not one of malice, but of a far more cutting clinical detachment. He looked at her as if she were a ledger entry that simply wouldn't balance. "The king has been most firm, Elena," he had said, his voice steady against the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the stable roof. "A prince does not marry for affection, he marries for the stability of the realm. Lady Serafina brings a dowry of 3 provinces and a bloodline that stretches back to the founding. You bring only yourself." Elena's lips had trembled, her voice a mere whisper lost to the wind. "You told me I was enough. You said my heart was the only kingdom you ever wanted." Adrian had looked away then, his gaze drifting toward the distant silhouette of the palace towers. He reached into the silken purse at his belt, the clink of metal sharp and final. Without a word of comfort, he took her hand, the hand that had held his just the night before, and pressed a single, heavy gold coin into her palm. "For your troubles," he muttered, the words landing like a physical blow. "To ensure you aren't left entirely without means, go back to the countryside, Elena, find a quiet life. Forget that you ever walked these halls." He hadn't waited for her response. He had turned on his heel, his polished boots splashing through the puddles as he walked toward the waiting carriage where Serafina de Verou sat, a splash of vibrant silk behind the glass. Elena had stood frozen in the deluge, her fingers curling around the cold, hard edge of the gold piece. It wasn't a gift, it was a severance. It was the price he had placed on her dignity, her love, and her future. As the carriage pulled away, spraying mud onto the hem of her cheap skirt, Elena didn't cry. She simply stared at the coin, the weight of his betrayal minted in 24-karat gold. In that freezing darkness, the soft, pliable girl he had known died. She looked at the retreating crest of the Veilcrest family and made a silent, jagged vow. She would keep this coin. She would keep it until the day she could buy his pride with it. The scent of expensive jasmine and cloying lilies heralded Lady Seraphina's approach before her shadow even touched the stable floor. She stepped from the shelter of the velvet-lined carriage, a vision of shimmering silver silk that made the grey afternoon look even more desolate. Her movements were fluid, predatory, and entirely practiced. Without a glance at the mud, she reached out and wound her arm through Adrian's, a silent, possessive claim that made the gold coin in Elena's hand feel like a hot coal. "Adrian, darling, the horses are getting restless, and the damp is simply ruinous for my hair," Seraphina murmured, her voice like honey poured over a blade. She finally turned her gaze toward Elena, her eyes raking over the girl's soaked cotton dress with a look of amused revulsion. "And who is this charming little creature? One of the stable hand's daughters? She looks quite drowned, poor thing." Adrian's jaw tightened, his gaze fixed resolutely on the horizon, refusing to meet Elena's eyes. "A former acquaintance, Seraphina, nothing more. I was merely ensuring she had the means to return to her village." Seraphina let out a light, melodic laugh that echoed cruelly against the damp stone walls. She reached out with a gloved hand, daintily flicking a droplet of muddy water off Adrian's lapel, as if she were brushing away Elena's entire existence. "How very charitable of you, my love. But really, one mustn't encourage them. They develop such unrealistic expectations when a prince shows them the slightest bit of notice." She leaned closer to Elena, the diamonds at her throat flashing with a cold, predatory light. "Take the coin, girl. It's likely more than your father earns in a year. Buy yourself a sturdy pair of boots and a husband who smells of hay instead of heartbreak. You were a fleeting distraction, a peasant's dream in a royal garden. But the sun has set, and it's time for you to go back to the dirt where you belong." Elena stood motionless, her knuckles white as she squeezed the gold piece. She didn't flinch, and she didn't look away. She watched as Seraphina pulled Adrian toward the carriage, the prince following like a dog on a silken leash. As the door clicked shut and the Veilcrest crest began to move away, Elena felt something inside her snap, not with the sound of a heart breaking, but with the sound of a forge being lit. The peasant's dream was over. She looked down at the mud staining her hem and then up at the retreating glitter of the royal carriage. Seraphina had called her small, a thing to be flicked away like a stray drop of rain. In that moment, amidst the stench of wet earth and the sting of public mockery, Elena Ashbourne made a silent, jagged promise to the empty air. She would become so great, so untouchable, and so powerful that the very ground Seraphina walked upon would eventually belong to her. She would never be small again. The transition from a broken girl in the mud to the mistress of a grand estate did not happen with a fairy tale flourish. It was a cold, calculated reconstruction. 2 years after Adrian's betrayal, Elena stood in the vaulted library of Ashbourne Manor, the scent of old parchment and beeswax replacing the stench of the stables. Opposite her sat the Duke of Ashbourne, a man of 80 years whose body was failing, but whose mind remained a sharp, cynical blade. He had not married her for her beauty, though her quiet intensity had intrigued him. He had married her because he saw in her eyes the same predatory hunger for survival that had built his own empire. "A title is a target, Elena," he had wheezed on their wedding night, handing her a ledger instead of a silk nightgown. "Wealth is the only armor that doesn't rust. If you wish to punish those who cast you out, you must first own the ground they walk upon." Elena took to her new life with a ferocity that startled even the Duke. While the other noblewomen of the county spent their afternoons gossiping over tea, Elena remained entombed in the library, illuminated by the flickering light of a single candelabra. She traded her embroidery needles for a quill, immersing herself in the labyrinthine world of contract law and high-stakes finance. She studied the rise and fall of grain prices, the intricacies of maritime insurance, and the hidden debt structures that propped up the very aristocrats who had once mocked her. She learned that power was not found in a prince's fickle affection, but in the fine print of a deed. Under the Duke's tutelage, she became a ghost in the machinery of the kingdom's economy. She operated through shell companies and anonymous proxies, slowly buying up the failing mortgages of the lesser nobility. Every night, she would touch the single gold coin Adrian had given her, now kept in a velvet-lined box, and use its weight to ground her focus. When the Duke finally passed, leaving her his title and a fortune that staggered the crown's own treasurers, Elena did not weep. She stood at the head of the long mahogany table in the counting room, her spine as rigid as a spear. She was no longer the charming little creature Serafina had ridiculed. She was the Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne, a woman who understood that the law was a weapon and gold was the ammunition. As she signed her first executive order to seize a defaulting estate in the north, she felt the first true warmth in her chest in years. She was no longer small, she was the silent architect of a coming ruin. The rot did not begin in the palace walls, but in the silken cage of Prince Adrian's marriage. Within 3 years, the advantageous union that had cost him Elena's soul had become a slow-acting poison. Lady Serafina was not a partner, she was a void that no amount of gold could fill. Her appetite for excess was legendary: midnight masks that cost the price of a battleship, gowns woven with crushed pearls that were discarded after a single evening, and a personal court of sycophants who whispered treason in the high-ceilinged drawing rooms of the Valecrest estate. Adrian watched, paralyzed by a mixture of pride and growing dread, as his ancestral treasury began to bleed. Serafina's laughter, once melodic, now sounded like the shearing of metal. "A prince of the blood does not count pennies, Adrian," she would sneer, her eyes cold as she signed away another timber forest to pay for a diamond-encrusted harness for her carriage horses. "If the crown's allowance is insufficient, perhaps it is time we sat upon a larger throne." It was this vanity that led him into the darkness. Driven by the need to fund Serafina's gluttony and a desperate desire to regain the power he felt slipping through his fingers, Adrian allowed himself to be whispered into a conspiracy. The plan was a coup of shadows, a subtle shifting of the succession that promised him the regency. But Serafina's ambitions were louder than her discretion. She treated the treason like a social game, involving reckless young lords and power-hungry generals who saw Adrian not as a leader, but as a convenient shield. The failure was as swift as it was absolute. The king's intelligence was far superior to Serafina's vanity. In a single night of rain and iron, the conspirators were rounded up. Adrian was spared the executioner's axe only because of his bloodline, but the price was a living death. He was stripped of his military commissions, his lands were placed under royal sequestration, and his name became a punchline in the very salons where he had once been worshipped. In the hollowed-out silence of their crumbling manor, Serafina did not offer comfort. She offered only venom. "I married a king in waiting," she hissed, packing her remaining jewels as the bailiffs pounded on the front oak doors. "Not a beggar with a hollow crown." She left him in the dark, the echoes of her departure sounding remarkably like the closing of a carriage door 10 years prior. Adrian sat alone in the library, staring at the empty shelves where his history used to live, realizing too late that the woman he had chosen had not only taken his future, she had devoured his past. The hum of the auctioneer's gavel was a rhythmic executioner's axe, chopping away the final remnants of the Valecrest name. The grand ballroom of the ancestral estate, once the site of gilded galas and royal toasts, had been stripped of its dignity. It was now a marketplace of ghosts. Prospective buyers, merchants with grease-stained fingers and minor gentry with hungry eyes, poked at the velvet divans and peered into the cracks of the marquetry as if inspecting a carcass. Adrian stood in the shadows of the mezzanine, his presence as thin and inconsequential as the dust motes dancing in the cold afternoon light. He watched as his heritage was dismantled, lot by lot. The silverware went first, followed by the library of first editions he had never bothered to read, and finally, the heavy, all-painted history of his bloodline. "Lot 42, the auctioneer droned, gesturing toward the massive portrait of Adrian's grandfather, the duke who had secured the family's proximity to the throne. "Starting bid, 500 sovereigns." A silence fell over the room, the kind of silence that precedes a tragedy. Adrian waited for the shame to swallow him whole, but before the gavel could fall on a low-ball offer from a local wool merchant, a gloved hand rose from the back of the room. 5,000, a voice rang out, low, steady, and chilled by a layer of absolute authority. The room turned as one. Seated in the shadows of the rear alcove was a woman draped in mourning silk, so black it seemed to absorb the dim light. A heavy lace veil obscured her features, but the tilt of her head radiated a terrifying, focused composure. She did not look at the crowd, she looked only at the auctioneer. 5,000 for the portrait of the Duke, the auctioneer stammered, his professional mask slipping. Going once, going twice. 10,000 for the entire gallery, the veiled woman interrupted, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. The portraits, the tapestries, and the veil crest seal, one bid for the soul of the house. The room erupted in a feverish whisper. Adrian felt a chill crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the drafty hall. There was something familiar in the way she sat, the rigid spine, the folded hands, the aura of royal repose that felt like a mockery of his own fallen status. He watched as the gavel fell, again and again, each strike transferring his family's identity to this nameless stranger. The session ended and the crowd dispersed. The woman rose. For a fleeting second, her veiled gaze drifted upward to the mezzanine. Adrian felt the weight of her scrutiny, a physical pressure that made his heart hammer against his ribs. She didn't speak, and she didn't reveal her face. She simply turned and walked toward the waiting black carriage outside, leaving Adrian to realize with a sickening jolt that he no longer owned even his own ancestors. They belonged to her now. Everything belonged to her. The scent of roasted venison and expensive cognac drifted through the open windows of the royal conservatory, a cruel taunt to the man shivering in the shadows of the colonnade. Adrian stood at the edge of the light, his threadbare evening suit, a relic from a decade ago, strained at the shoulders, the fabric shiny with age and frequent brushing. He was a ghost haunting his own life, a man reduced to the status of a supplicant, hopping to catch the eye of a former ally who might grant him a minor clerkship or a pittance of a loan. The gala was a sea of moving silk and flashing medals, a vibrant tapestry of power that he no longer belonged to. He watched through the glass, his heart heavy with the metallic taste of shame, until the orchestra's music swelled into a triumphal fanfare. The chatter of the hundreds of guests died away instantly, replaced by a reverent, expectant silence. The king stood at the head of the great hall, raising a chalice of hammered gold. Beside him stood a woman who seemed to command the very air around her. She was draped in emerald velvet, so deep it looked like the heart of a forest, and across her breast lay the crimson sash of the royal order, the highest honor the crown could bestow upon a subject of merit. To the woman who saved the national credit, the king's voice boomed, echoing into the night. To the Duchess of Ashbourne, whose brilliance in finance has secured our borders more effectively than any army, to Lady Alina. A thunderous roar of "to Lady Alina" shook the glass panes. Adrian's knees buckled, and he had to catch himself against a cold marble pillar. It was her, the charming little creature from the stables, the girl he had bought off with a single gold coin. She stood bathed in the golden glow of 1,000 candles, her face a mask of exquisite, chilling composure. She did not smile as the elite of the kingdom bowed their heads to her. She simply nodded, her diamond tiara fracturing the light into jagged spears that seemed to pierce right through the glass and into Adrian's soul. She wasn't just a guest, she was the guest of honor. She wasn't just wealthy, she was the architect of the kingdom's survival. Adrian stared, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had come here to find a patron, to find a way to crawl out of the mud. But as he watched the king himself lean in to whisper a joke into Alina's ear, watching her respond with a grace that made every other woman in the room look like a commoner, the crushing weight of his mistake finally broke him. The girl he had discarded for being not enough had become the only woman in the world who mattered. And as her cold, grey eyes swept toward the windows, Adrian instinctively recoiled into the darkness, terrified that the woman he had created would finally see the wreckage he had become. The rain had returned, a cold, persistent drizzle that turned the palace forecourt into a mirror of liquid obsidian. Prince Adrian waited by the massive gold-gilded gates, his breath hitching in his chest as the heavy vibration of approaching hooves shook the ground. This was the moment of his ultimate surrender. When the black lacquer carriage of the Ashbourne estate slowed to a halt, the king's guard stepped forward, their red tunics a stark, bloody contrast to the grey mist. As the door opened, Alina stepped out. She was a pillar of emerald velvet and icy resolve, her movements possessing a lethal elegance that made the air feel thin. She did not look at the man trembling in the shadows. She looked through him as if he were merely a trick of the light. "Elena, wait," Adrian's voice cracked, raw and desperate. He lunged forward, ignored the sharp warning clicks of the guards' rifles, and collapsed onto the wet cobblestones directly in her path. The mud splashed upward, staining his frayed cuffs, but he didn't care. He fell to his knees, his hands clasped in a white-knuckled prayer of supplication. "My heart has always been your kingdom," he choked out, the words tasting like poison on his tongue. It was the exact phrase he had whispered to her in the royal gardens 10 years ago, back when he had used it to trap her soul. "I was lost, blinded by the expectations of my blood, but I see now. I have always loved you, Elena. Please, don't leave me in the dark again." He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with a ragged, ugly cry of genuine shame. He felt the weight of 100 eyes upon him, the elite peering from their carriages. The stoic guards acting as witnesses to his absolute undoing. It was a public execution of his dignity, a final stripping of the Veilcrest pride. Elena halted. For a long, suffocating second, the only sound was the rhythmic drumming of the rain on her silk umbrella. She looked down at him, her face a mask of royal indifference that was more devastating than rage. Her eyes remained cold and stoic, drifting over his kneeling form as if assessing a broken piece of furniture left out for the night's refuse. "The words are the same, Adrian," she said, her voice as clear and cutting as a winter frost. "But the woman who believed them died in a stable 10 years ago." She didn't pull away in anger. She simply stepped around him, her heavy skirts brushing against his mud-stained coat. The guards closed ranks behind her, a physical barrier of steel and silk, leaving the prince of the blood kneeling in the filth of the gutter, begging a ghost for a life he had already thrown away. The rain continued to fall, a relentless grey veil that blurred the line between the palace and the gutter. Adrian remained on his knees, his forehead nearly touching the wet cobblestones, waiting for a touch, a word of pity, or even a strike of anger, anything to prove that he still existed in her world. Elena did not move. She stood as a pillar of emerald velvet, her shadow stretching long and dark over his shaking frame. "You speak of kingdoms and hearts, Adrian," she said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal silkiness that cut through the sound of the downpour. "But you always lacked the vision to see who truly held the power. You thought Seraphina's dowry was your salvation. You thought the crown's sequestration was your ruin. You never stopped to ask who was holding the pen when your debts were signed away." Adrian looked up, his face gaunted by cold and confusion. "What are you saying?" "I am Ashbourne Holdings," Elena replied, her expression as stoic and unreadable as a marble bust. "Every acre of Veilcrest timber, every portrait of your ancestors, every single penny you owe to the royal treasury, it all belongs to me. I didn't just watch your downfall, Adrian, I funded it. I waited until you were at your most desperate, and then I bought your life." The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him breathless in the mud. The mysterious veiled woman at the auction, the anonymous creditors who had squeezed him into a corner, it had all been her. She hadn't just survived, she had become the architect of his extinction. Elena reached into the small, beaded reticule at her waist. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and excruciatingly calm. She pulled out a small, heavy object that caught the flickering amber light of the palace lanterns. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed it. The object landed in the mud inches from Adrian's knees with a dull, wet thud. It was a single gold coin, its edges worn, but its weight unmistakable. 10 years ago, you gave me this for my troubles," she said, the irony in her voice sharper than any blade. "You told me to buy a new life. Well, I have, and now I'm returning the investment." She leaned down slightly, her emerald gown shimmering as she looked him directly in his hollowed eyes. "Take it, Adrian. It is exactly what you are worth to me now. Use it to buy a coat that fits, or perhaps a loaf of bread to see you through the night. But never again speak to me of love. A queen does not negotiate with her debtors." Without another word, she turned her back on him. The heavy iron gates of the palace began to groan shut, the sound final and absolute, leaving Adrian alone in the freezing darkness with nothing but a single gold coin and the mud of his own making. The sound of the gold coin hitting the mud was the final note in a symphony 10 years in the making. Adrian stared at the small, glinting circle of metal, the exact price of his arrogance, and for a moment the world went silent. He reached out a trembling, mud-caked hand to touch it, but the shadow of a king's guard fell over him, cold and immovable. "Move along, sir," the guard commanded, his voice devoid of the deference Adrian had spent a lifetime demanding. "You're obstructing the Duchess's path." Two soldiers stepped forward, their gloved hands firm as they hoisted the broken prince from the cobblestones. He didn't fight them. He didn't have the strength left to even weep. As they led him away into the freezing darkness of the London fog, his silhouette looked small and fragile, a discarded relic of a dynasty that no longer held any currency. He was a man with a gold coin and a hollow chest, disappearing into the anonymity of the city he had once thought he owned. Elena stood perfectly still, watching the darkness swallow him. The rain pattered against her silk umbrella, but not a single drop touched her skin. She felt a strange, profound lightness, as if a heavy iron weight she had been carrying since that day in the stables had finally dissolved into the mist. There was no surge of manic joy, no petty thrill of cruelty, only the deep, resonant pulse of a debt finally settled in full. She raised a hand, her fingers steady as she made a microscopic adjustment to the Ashbourne tiara. The diamonds felt right. They didn't feel like a burden or a disguise anymore. They were simply a part of her, as much as the scars on her heart. She took a slow, deep breath of the rain-cooled air, the scent of jasmine and wet stone filling her lungs. For the first time in a decade, the air didn't taste like ash. "Your Grace," her footman whispered, holding the heavy palace door open. "Thank you, Thomas," she replied, her voice soft but absolute. She turned away from the gates and walked toward the warmth of the golden light spilling from the foyer. Her emerald skirts hissed against the marble floor, a sound of triumph and finality. As the massive oak doors groaned shut behind her, sealing out the cold and the ghost of the man who had tried to break her, Elena Ashbourne smiled, not for the court and not for the king, but for the girl who had survived the mud. She was finally at peace. Was Elena too heartless in her revenge, or did Adrian get exactly what he deserved? Comment your thoughts below.